Huey Long was wrong by Ellen Carmichael. The Louisiana politician is unworthy of the admiration he gets from the left and increasingly from the right. Hello everyone, welcome to a new video on Marshal Politics. What I just read is the opening to this article called Huey Long Was Wrong from the National Review, which I'm pretty sure all you know is basically this establishment conservative newspaper. They're war hogs, they're fiscal conservatives, some of them are even left wing on social issues as well. So, I mean, they're complete garbage. And I encourage you to read other newspapers like American Greatness or Chronicles Magazine, where Pedro Gonzalez is writing. So, this article was published just about 3 days ago, and this got a lot of attention from people I know on Twitter. Sean had Pedro Gonzalez and many others, Michael Foster, others. And for obvious reasons, because this is actually the first article I've seen um, actually talking about Huey Long in the modern sense, how he's gotten so much admiration from people on the right now. Um, and I am one of those people, actually. I read an entire book about Huey Long called The Kingfish, written by, he was Richard White, I believe, about a few months ago. It's a pretty good book. Um, I learned about Long's governing style and how effective he was as a politician, really how ambitious he was. And I think, in my opinion, that's the kind of energy and thinking that we need on the new right today. So, the National Review decided to go after Huey Long, and in the original tweet, I mean, like, oh my god, they got 544 likes, they got ratioed here, another ratio here. That was a funny one. And I mean, they got completely obliterated. And it is interesting because Huey Long has been dead for over 75 years. He was assassinated in 1935, uh, in September 1935, in the Louisiana legislature. Um, and recently there's been a lot of energy thrown behind him that started through various forms, mostly due to, I think they actually mentioned in the opening part of the article, nearly a century after his death, the Kingfish is making a comeback. Fans of the late Louisiana politician Huey P. Long can be found across the partisan divide, with populist conservatives and socialist Democrats embracing his message of economic equality under the banner of every man a king. These days, he's even a featured character in Hearts of Iron 4, a computer war game, and he's developed a cult following among gamers. Pretty funny, by the way. He's a featured character in a mod for the game, but whatever. Um, but I think that is actually partially a reason why, and I just think that because of that, more people have become interested in him. I mean, uh, people didn't really know who Huey Long was really. I mean, I've talked to many of my families, and even the people who were interested in history. Is like they didn't know that much about him. They knew he was like governor of Louisiana, but they didn't really know much else. But he has been making resurgence, which I view it as a positive thing. They view it as a negative thing. Um, and they're very concerned about populists on the right, as can be seen in the opening article. And it's actually really interesting. So here they basically say that his policies are like being seen in politicians today. I wish. Um, like some of his policies, not all of it, obviously, but it says here evidence of Long's peculiar cultural resurrection can be found on the left, and universal basic income advocates such as Andrew Yang and avowedly socialist lawmakers such as Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is, again, establishment shill, so it's pretty funny. Just swap out, share the wealth for $1,000 checks, and retaliating against Standard Oil for targeting millionaires and billionaires, and the kingfish lives again. It's amazing to compare $1,000 checks to distribution of wealth. Really insane. Um, anyways, basically, they just whine that Huey Long is making a resurgence today, and they say, oh, like, all these policies are failures, and they'll even, towards the end of the article, they'll say, here, for all his populist promises, the reality of living under Long was a painful one, and the damage he did to Louisiana has never been fully repaired. During his time in politics, he has hurt a lot of people, eroded important civic institutions, and enacted policies that even today leave Louisianans behind. What, like building roads? It's like building roads has left Louisiana behind? Ridiculous. Um, so, I mean, like, it's just, they don't even mention what specific policies. I mean, the major programs that Long enacted in the state were largely public works and infrastructure. He built a new state capital. He modernized Louisiana's roads. Actually, in the book I was mentioning that I read, The Kingfish, it basically said like how long it would take to drive from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, and it would take a ridiculously long time, even though it was a relatively shorter distance. But after Long's roads were built, that time was significantly, I think it was overcut in half. I don't have the specific number, but I'd say, but it was a significant improvement. But I mean, they'll continue to sprout this propaganda, and I think that overall, I think that really the National Review and like these people that are in the conservative establishment are actually worried about what's actually about the actual Republican base and how they're moving away from this right wing economic dogma. And I mean, there's tons of polls now. I saw a poll that showed that I think almost a majority of Republicans supported a wealth tax, while I think like 45% or so supported Medicare for, or it might have been a majority. That might be an older poll, but there's a significant movement in the right now where you have people actually realizing how broken and terrible the current establishment is, and unlike the Trumpists who essentially like claim they're anti-establishment, but they end up just supporting establishment policies in the end. These more people on the right now are realizing really what must change, and that's just policy overall. Now Trump is actually just he's not he's just the one who woke in all this. He's not going to be making all the significant changes in society. Um, anyways, this article really exploded on Twitter. Got attention from a lot of people, as I said earlier, and for good reason, because it's just blatantly ridiculous. So they cite an article from Pedro Gonzalez, which I did mention in a previous video right here, the long shot, which I made a video about a couple months ago, I think. So he says in the May column, she says in a May column for American Greatness, writer Pedro Gonzalez waxed poetic about Long, directing modern-day conservatives to seize his political blueprint as their own. The Kingfish, oh, by the way, Gonzalez, they didn't even spell it right. There's an S instead of a Z. Gonzalez claimed, the Kingfish Gonzalez claimed was what Donald Trump only pretended to be, a successful fighter for the common man, coming from one of the most Trump-centric outlets on the right. It was an eye-opening assertion. Yeah, because it's true, and like you don't really see this that much. So he sees she says in his hagiography of Long, Gonzalez implies again, let's see, spelled wrong. Gonzalez implies that the politician fought for the working class because his poor white upbringing gave him an understanding of human suffering. But in the spirit of a good grift, the backstory Long told about himself, and Long apologists still tell today, is a lie. So you'll actually see this a lot, for some reason, from people who oppose Long. They'll basically claim that he actually wasn't that poor and that his family was relatively well off. And yeah, his family was definitely slightly better than the people in other people in Wynn Parish. But regardless, his family was still pretty poor considering the massive wealth that um, corporations outside the state held. So, anyways, was there were outside corporations in Louisiana, outside the state of Louisiana, who controlled a significant amount of wealth in the state, usually, largely through the oil industry, which Long was a fierce opponent of later throughout his career. So Huey Long was actually pretty poor. I mean, when he actually went to Louisiana State University, he couldn't even afford the pay for the board in the room. So he had to study law and he attempted to get extra money, and that doesn't really sound like someone who's, pretty well off. So it's actually it's the same crap here. She says, though on the campaign trail he led voters to believe that he was raised in a log cabin, he was actually born to an affluent family who lived on a sprawling estate in northern Louisiana, and it's actually pretty ridiculous. And one of the last things they claim here is even as he lived lavishly on taxpayer dime, indulging. Wait, sorry. Long would lament to clouds that he was as poor as they were, even as he lived lavishly on the taxpayer dime, indulging his pensions for extravagant clothes, luxury homes, booze, and fine dining. Um, that was really just because of he actually get he actually got money over time, partially through, of course, his deduct box, which say employees were forced to contribute to. Um, but either way, this is not actually relevant to what Long's message is, and you'll actually see this a lot from people who are opposed to these like progressives or populists. Is that they'll say, "Oh, they're rich and like they don't actually serve your interests or whatever." And that, of course, can be true for some. I mean, Trump is definitely a good example of that. But that is seen not through his background, but by what he actually did in a position of power. And Long, although he was pretty well off later on, he did push for policies that generally benefited most people, except for the corporations, of course. Um, So like that part is actually largely irrelevant, but it's just another smear tactic that the establishment likes to use against populists or progressives, whatever term you like there. So they'll say all this other stuff. So here she cites throughout his time in politics, Long clearly saw himself as outside and above the law. He once declared, "I am the Constitution." Now it was a very funny. Actually, I remember the instance. He's saying like to anyone who dared him that he was too powerful to be tamed by laws, ethics, or even basic manners. So actually, this whole story is actually more funny than scary because when Huey Long was patrolling the Louisiana state legislature, there was basically a member of the legislature that said like you shouldn't be here, and like they were like voting on something, and this was a famous thing that Long would do in order to make sure that he got his way in the votes, in order to apply pressure on the voter um, on the members of the legislature. So the member of the legislature basically said to him like you shouldn't be here, and he threw a copy of his Constitution of Louisiana at him. And then Long picked it up, and then he said, sorry, he Long picked it up, and then the legislature, member of the legislature said like you should read this, and then Long says, "No, I am the Constitution now," and it's actually pretty funny, but it's I actually like people like to fearmonger about authoritarianism, um, when it doesn't benefit them. Like I'm pretty sure that the National Review would be perfectly fine if the government cracked down on protests that were anti-war or whatever. They started a new war in Cuba, for example, or Venezuela, and there were protests in the streets against it. I'm sure they'd be fine with deploying you know National Guardsmen, or I don't know, maybe even the military in some extreme case in order to stop these protests. So, I mean, of course they'd be fine to do that, but you know, authoritarians acting in the interest of the people, no good. And again, that just they don't really have any principled stance against authoritarianism. I mean, they'd be proud to use it to accomplish their own ends, and that's why I think that this is actually a useful lesson, because I think this should encourage us not to, be scared of these ridiculous attacks by the establishment. Oh, you're an authoritarian. You're using power for you know bad ends, and like you shouldn't be able to do this. It's like no, you should just ignore them and actually finish what you actually started. So, I mean, the basically the article goes on. It continues to say how powerful Long became later on. So this is actually just one last thing I want to read from here. Actually, this one here. In happier times, most conservatives would find such an instinct repulsive and antithetical to Americans' belief in justice and fairness under the law. Now a growing contingent of populists seem to find Long's tactics worth celebrating and replicating. In American Greatness, sorry, in American Greatness, Gonzalez argued, again spelled wrong, argued that the right should embrace Long's method, his spiritedness, his willingness to fight dirty against corrupt elites who only yelp for civility and constitutionalism when they're losing. Yeah, that's the point I agree with. So it's pretty amazing, and I think the worst part is they try to blame Louisiana's current problems on Long. They say all these statistics about it, and I think that's more or less, I think, just has to do with the whole structure of the state now. I don't think that's necessarily caused by Long. Um, so, anyways, that's really it from this article. I will put a link to it in the description, if you would like to read it. Um, but yeah, the next piece I just wanted to show was a piece written by Michael Foster yesterday, and he basically talked about this whole issue with the article and how the conservative establishment is really afraid of this. This resurgence of Huey Long's popularity. So he basically argues how Long actually is again a useful model for people on the right now. And he says here, while much of the right has softened, I meant to read the first word. Long's governorship was defined by his opposition to business interests in his state, particularly the oil industry. He raised taxes on corporations and the well-off and invested the proceeds in basic infrastructure, schools, and hospitals. As a United States Senator and presidential aspirant, his signature proposal, the Share Wealth Plan, was far to the left of anything Bernie Sanders has proposed, included a hard cap on personal wealth, as well as a number of generous entitlements. So that actually mentions a point that Carmichael made at the beginning of the article, where she argues that somehow Long's policies are seeing a resurgence today, which is not true at all. So, and this is one of the important parts here. Much of the right has softened in its devotions to market fundamentalism in embrace of Long's economics seems like an enormous overcorrection. In true framing, admiration for Long is best thought of as a reaction against libertarianism, which I agree with. After years of hearing that any economic approach to the left of Calvin Coolidge was tantamount to socialism, many right-wing populists began to take a perverse pleasure in shutting back every man a king. So I do believe that as well. Um, and he cites several quotes from this book called All the King's Men, which is a fictional historical book with the main character basically loosely based off of Long and what he did in Louisiana. Um, so he cites from Pedro Gonzalez that the populist movement should strive to create its own army of bureaucrats in captured offices, though it need not to embrace a carbon copy of Long's redistributive program. It should embrace his method, his spirit, and is willing to fight his willingness to fight dirty against corrupt elites who only yield for civility and constitutionalism when they're losing. And I agree. So again, he actually talks about how Trump has he at that point that Long made, sorry, Gonzalez made here, that the kingfish was actually what Donald Trump only pretended to be. So Foster says Donald Trump's early rhetoric and political style invite comparison with Long's messaging, but the contrast between their approaches to governing were close study. Long's power rested in large part on the loyalty of an army of bureaucrats. Trump sometimes declined to fill key posts, and those appointees that he did manage to install often undermined him. Long targeted Louisiana's financial elites with confiscatory taxes. Trump did the opposite. Long's antagonism towards Standard Oil never cooled, perhaps believing that they would never forgive him for his earlier opposition. Trump hired Wall Street executives who would never in a million years have supported him. Unlike Hannibal and perhaps unlike Trump, Long used his victories as skillfully as he had won them. And that's completely true. This ties into a whole other point that I always make in pretty much every single video I make on this channel, that we should actually be using power to accomplish our own ends, and we shouldn't be afraid of these ridiculous calls by, the establishment. They're like, oh, you're undermining democracy, and like all this fucking, sorry for cursing, but all this nonsense. Anyways, I like this conclusion here. Returning briefly to Long's economic agenda, is worth considering that his public works projects aren't necessarily suitable for imitation. Most populists endorse some increased level of infrastructure spending, but the returns on the sorts of investment the Long pursued were much higher in his era. Improving existing roads in rural areas won't have the same impact as building the first roads there. We won't fix education simply by building new schoolhouses, nor will we repair our healthcare system just by building new hospitals. Reform is more complicated than construction, and long solutions can't be our solutions. I agree. Still, aspirational figures can be hard to come by, especially in our area of defeatism and managed decline. Huey Long is worthy of our admiration, and I mean that unironically, and I completely agree. Anyways, I just wanted to mention one thread on Twitter here. So Pedro Gonzalez says, National Review writing a hit piece on populist Huey Long, who has been dead for nearly a century as corporations presently strangle Americans, is a perfect example of why the National Review is worse than useless. You know what's worse than the ADL and PayPal deplatforming you and Bank of America sending the FBI to your house? The long-dead populists who bully journalists. Of course, it's joking there. At National Review, you hate overly corrupt populists and love politicians who hide their corruption, like Paul Ryan. That's called principles. And that's exactly correct. This is a point I made before. The establishment doesn't have any, principled position on corruption or authoritarianism. They just like to do it to accomplish their own ends. So we shouldn't be scared by their ridiculous calls for this. So this is just one final part. The appeal of Long is not exactly his economics, but his willingness to confront a corrupt political establishment of his own political machine long after it had ceased to serve people. Conservatives naturally miss this because they're so concerned with playing nice. But as left-wing economics screen the people representing a movement of uninterrupted failure for the last 30 or 40 years. Huey Long used his corrupt political machine to help people, whereas myself, the principal conservative, prefer it when corrupt political machines help defense contractors and lie to me about it. I prefer it when my politicians only help themselves and lie to me about it and instead tell me about bootstraps and quote Reagan or something. So, I think that's mostly correct. I think that some people actually do follow Long's economics. I partially do, not entirely, though. But anyways, I just want to conclude this video here. And I know I've read quite a lot, but I think that it's just important to read from because this is really what the basis should be for the national populist movement. Like, it's the term I like to use now for people like myself and others. Because we're really populists that work for the national well-being, and that comes through regulatory policies against large corporations, the end of foreign intervention abroad, which does not serve our interests, it only serves the interests of defense contractors and the rich. Um, so our policy, our main goal is really just to help the majority of Americans in America abroad. And a lot of people like to co-opt this language, and you've probably seen a lot of establishment GOP politicians using the term America First, or like they support American workers or some nonsense. You'll notably see that from people like Jane Timken or Josh Mandel, probably some of the most pathetic Senate candidates I've ever seen. And many others, not just them. I mean, you see Ted Cruz, many others, people who have supported the party line for years, but are now all of a sudden fighting for Americans, which is totally not true. Um, we need to actually. I just don't want people to fall for this nonsense. I don't think people will, but I just think it's worthy to um, point out um, of all this co-opting of language from the establishment. The point I was trying to make is that um, when we're actually in power, we should use institutions to our advantage and actually use political machines and use our leverage in order to push for what we actually want. And we shouldn't be scared of any um, attacks by people in the establishment who do not care for the interests of the American people. And I think that the national populists are uniquely positioned to actually make a difference in America. But obviously, it's just the beginning. And I think that in the future, we just need more people to advocate for platform out there. And I think that change can actually come from the top down. And I think that if we're able to effectively get control of the national government with an actual national populace, then I think that victories will come through. So, and the final thing that I mentioned that I actually mentioned at the beginning of this video is that the Republican establishment is actually very concerned about the rising popularity of people on the right who are actually realizing how strong the establishment is. I mean, you're seeing an increasing amount of people who are beginning to lose faith in establishment economic theory and are beginning to realize that um, we need to support actual populism that benefits people rather than this free trade, Reagan economic dogma that Republican politicians continue to um, support continuously. Um, so I hope you all enjoyed this video. I know that probably this was a bit of a long video, but I do hope you all enjoyed. Um, and I hope you have an excellent day, and I will see you all in the next video for what